This is the world we've all been taught to believe in, a fairy tale of royal grandeur, where kings and queens lived in palaces fit for gods. The halls were filled with opulence beyond our wildest dreams, each room more lavish than the last, brimming with gold, silks and jewels. It's a picture of perfection that we've come to admire, a symbol of power and privilege that shaped the course of history. But what if everything we thought we knew about this royal lifestyle was built on a lie? What if the reality of life in these glittering palaces was far darker, more disturbing than anyone could have imagined? For centuries, royal courts were not just a place of wealth and beauty, they were hotbeds of disease, decay and suffering. Behind the gilded walls and ornate tapestries, the very people who lived in luxury were often trapped in unsanitary conditions, suffering from diseases, parasites and unspeakable discomfort. These palaces, which we romanticize as symbols of grace and elegance, were often nothing more than breeding grounds for filth and death. While the rest of the world admired the grandeur of these courts, those who lived within them were dealing with the horrors of poor hygiene, overwhelming smells, and a society completely unprepared for the spread of disease. What seemed like a fairy tale to outsiders was, in reality, a nightmare of unspeakable conditions, hidden behind layers of beauty and wealth. This was the true face of royal life, and today we're going to pull back the curtain to reveal the shocking, often grotesque truths that lay beneath the surface. If you've ever wondered what was going on behind the golden gates of history's grandest palaces, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Prepare yourself for a journey into the dark underbelly of royalty that most history books never dared to mention. In the 1580s, the courts of Europe, brimming with wealth and extravagance, held many secrets beneath their gilded facades. Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most famous monarchs in history, was known for her lavish lifestyle. But amid all the luxury, there was a chilling truth. Hygiene was a rare commodity in her world. The Queen, like most royalty of the time, adhered to a bath ritual once a month. This wasn't a simple cleansing experience. No, this was a drawn-out and sometimes nauseating process. A team of servants would laboriously prepare the bath, hauling water from distant wells to fill the massive tub. It was an ordeal, a far cry from the lavish images we associate with royal luxury today. The Queen's bath, prepared by her servants, would often be too tepid for any real cleansing. The water was reused, sometimes from one royal to the next, and in an era when basic hygiene was overlooked, the water became a breeding ground for bacteria. But that wasn't the only danger lurking. As she submerged herself in the water, Queen Elizabeth would apply layers of Venetian Sousse, a lead-based skin whitener that was all the rage in the court. This toxic concoction was believed to enhance her complexion, but it came at a deadly price. Venetian Sousse made with lead was applied carefully, layer upon layer, to achieve that porcelain skin the Queen so prized. Little did she know that each brushstroke was slowly poisoning her. As Elizabeth's beauty became more synonymous with her reign, the psychological toll became evident. Her health began to deteriorate, and with it, her mental state. The constant application of toxic cosmetics combined with the unsanitary conditions may have contributed to her mood swings and erratic behavior later in life. The pursuit of beauty was not just harmful to her body, but to her mind as well. The obsession with beauty, an essential part of royal life, would eventually become a curse for Elizabeth. In the face of vanity, she unknowingly played a part in her own health's destruction, turning beauty rituals into acts of self-harm. In the heart of the royal chambers, a dangerous ritual unfolds each morning. Elizabeth, the once vibrant young queen, now spends hours carefully applying layers of Venetian Sousse, a deadly concoction of lead, to her face. This act, seemingly innocent in the pursuit of beauty, hides a sinister truth. With each application, Elizabeth unknowingly poisons herself, layering one more coat of death over her already fragile health. The cycle is relentless. It begins each morning with her face being coated in layers of lead-based paint, but as the day wears on, the effects start to show physically, mentally, and emotionally. This daily routine, once a symbol of beauty and power, now becomes the catalyst for a slow decline. The lead from the Venetian suit seeps into Elizabeth's skin, entering her bloodstream. What starts as a mere imperfection in her appearance becomes a powerful, silent killer. The effects of lead poisoning on Elizabeth were devastating, but it wasn't just her body that suffered, it was her mind too. Over time, she began to experience memory loss, mood swings, and even violent outbursts, symptoms that were invisible to the court, but unmistakable to those who had eyes to see. The addiction to beauty, especially in the royal court, became a deadly trap. For Elizabeth, the need to maintain her beauty, the public's perception of her, became an obsession. The more she used Venetian suits, the more her mind and body deteriorated. Her hair, once thick and full, began to thin and fall out in clumps. Her memory, sharp and commanding in her younger years, now faltered. The violent mood swings she began to experience were a haunting symptom of the poison that now coursed through her veins. But this was only the beginning. As her physical beauty eroded, her behavior became more erratic. Court members whispered about her strange moods, her sudden bursts of anger, and the unsettling way she seemed to lose track of time and places. The once strong monarch, whose decisions shaped the course of an empire, now seemed like a mere shell of herself, trapped by the very beauty rituals that had defined her reign. Elizabeth had unknowingly become a prisoner of the beauty standards she once championed. The more she used the toxic makeup, the more addicted she became to maintaining her appearance. The lead had a psychological hold on her, shaping not only how she saw herself, but also how the world saw her. As the Queen became more distant and temperamental, those around her struggled to reconcile the powerful ruler they had once known with the woman before them. Her erratic behavior and sudden bursts of anger were seen as signs of weakness, and yet the truth was far more insidious. A woman whose pursuit of beauty was destroying her from the inside out. What began as a seemingly harmless ritual had now spiraled into a toxic addiction, ravaging both Elizabeth's body and mind. But there was more to this story. As the Queen's health deteriorated, something even darker was about to be uncovered. A story of hidden truths, royal secrets, and a society that chose to look the other way. In the early 1600s, the court of King James I was a place of opulence and power. Yet beneath the layers of velvet and silk, a terrifying epidemic was silently ravaging the royal chambers. Lice, what started as a minor inconvenience, became a widespread plague, crawling from one noble head to the next, leaving no one untouched. The king himself, draped in regal attire, sat at the center of the room, his fingers subtly scratching at his scalp beneath his crown. The nobles around him, princes, lords and ladies, shuffled uncomfortably, trying to ignore the ever-present itch that seemed to invade every corner of the court. But this was no ordinary nuisance. The facades were far more than just an annoyance, they were deadly carriers of disease. As lice spread through the court, the impact was not just physical, it was psychological. The itching and discomfort became unbearable, and soon the once beautiful royal chambers were filled with restless, distracted courtiers, their minds consumed by the relentless irritation. A mood of unease gripped the court, with every meeting and gathering turning into a silent battle against the constant crawling of lice. Lice, though often seen as a minor inconvenience, were the vectors for much more sinister diseases. Typhus, a deadly disease transmitted by the lice's bite, spread like wildfire through the crowded chambers. What was once a minor irritation had now become a public health crisis, threatening the lives of those closest to the king. The infestation was far worse than anyone realized. Lice were silent but deadly, transferring disease with every bite. Typhus, carried by these parasites, soon began to spread through the court like wildfire. Its symptoms were horrific: high fever, chills, delirium, and eventually death. As nobles and servants alike fell ill, the royal court of King James I found itself in the grip of an invisible enemy. As the lice infestation continued unchecked, the toll on the court's psyche grew. The once elegant court, filled with music, diplomacy, and merriment, was now a place of constant scratching, illness, and anxiety. King James I, known for his strong personality, could not escape the disease. He began to withdraw from his duties, his leadership faltering as the lice took their toll on his mind and body. The toll wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The court, once a place of power and beauty, now echoed with the sound of incessant scratching and quiet coughs. What had once been a symbol of European royalty now became a scene of disease and decay, but the worst was yet to come. As the king's court descended further into chaos, rumors began to swirl about the true extent of the lice infestation. Was this simply a case of poor hygiene, or was something darker at play? A hidden agenda, perhaps, that was driving the spread of disease. For centuries, the courts of Europe were filled with women who lived and died by beauty standards that demanded perfection at any cost. The desire for porcelain skin and flawless features led to the widespread use of Venetian ceruse, a toxic lead-based makeup that would ultimately change the course of many lives. Each morning, noble women across Europe would follow this ritual, layering on thick coats of Venetian serum, a beauty product made from lead. But what was once considered a symbol of elegance and power soon became a silent killer, one that claimed the health and sanity of countless women. Every layer of Venetian ceruse she applied over the years took its toll. The cracks in her skin, both physical and psychological, were becoming more evident. But this was a price many were willing to pay, desperate to meet the beauty standards set by society's most influential women. Venetian ceruse was not just a makeup, it was a symbol of beauty and status. It was coveted, sought after, and even revered. But as noble women caked their faces with layers of toxic lead, they unknowingly exposed themselves to grave consequences. Over time, the effects became impossible to ignore. The effects of the lead were not just physical. Women who wore Venetian ceruse for extended periods began to experience memory loss, paranoia, and a gradual disintegration of their mental faculties. The lead seeped into their skin, entering their bloodstream, slowly poisoning them from the inside out. What began as an innocent attempt to appear flawless soon spiraled into a nightmare. Many noble women, like this one, were unable to stop applying the makeup, despite the obvious signs of skin damage. Their obsession with beauty turned into a psychological addiction. The pursuit of perfection became all-consuming, and they became prisoners to their vanity. As the women of the court continued their beauty rituals, their bodies were slowly breaking down. Memory issues plagued them, their minds fogged by the toxins they willingly invited into their skin. Paranoia crept in as they became more and more fixated on their appearances, unable to accept the gradual decomposition that was becoming more and more visible. It wasn't just the skin that suffered. The women's hair began to thin, their teeth would rot from the inside out, and their internal organs began to deteriorate as the poison infiltrated their bodies. Their beauty, once a symbol of power and prestige, now became their slow undoing. Despite the visible signs of decay, the desire to retain beauty never faded. For many, the makeup had become an addiction, an obsession they could not break. As their bodies withered away, their mental health deteriorated, and they grew more paranoid, more isolated, unable to escape the very ritual that had once given them power. But as these women slowly descended into madness, another darker truth began to emerge. What if the Venetian ceruse was not just a product of vanity, but a tool used by those in power to control the women of the court? Could the allure of beauty have been a form of manipulation, a means to keep the powerful distracted, obsessed, and ultimately destroyed? The truth behind this toxic beauty ritual might be even more sinister than we imagined. In the royal courts of Europe, perfume was not just a luxury, it was a survival mechanism. In an era where bathing was rare and cleanliness was a distant dream, the application of perfume became a desperate attempt to disguise a far less fragrant reality. What we consider indulgence today was in fact a means of covering up years of festering hygiene problems. With their bodies steeped in sweat, dirt, and layers of old clothing, noble women had little choice but to turn to perfume to mask the stench of their own filth. What was once an elegant luxury soon became a daily ritual, one that no one at court could escape. The perfume wasn't just about smelling pleasant. It was about survival in a world where personal hygiene was rarely addressed. The court, with its extravagance and wealth, had no shortage of perfumes and colognes, yet no matter how many bottles were emptied, they could never fully mask the underlying stench of neglect. The perfume was in many ways a mask, a veil of false beauty, designed to shield the public from an uncomfortable truth. While today we associate perfume with luxury and refinement, in the past it was often more about covering up body odor than enhancing beauty. Bathing, an essential part of personal hygiene, was not the custom at court. In fact, the idea of frequent bathing was considered unhealthy by many, and most people at the royal court rarely bathed, sometimes going weeks or even months without a proper wash. The perfumes, though luxurious and expensive, only succeeded in adding to the problem. The overpowering scents of rose, lavender and musk mingled with the sour odors of unwashed bodies, creating a nauseating combination. The irony was undeniable. The more they applied, the more they masked. Not beauty, but filth. What started as a faint, subtle fragrance became a cloud of pungency, suffocating the air and numbing the senses. But beyond the physical effects, the perfume also had a profound psychological toll. As the aristocracy masked their odors with fragrance, they began to depend on the perfume to create an illusion of cleanliness, even though they knew deep down it was just a temporary fix. Their obsession with masking the truth reflected a deeper sense of insecurity, a need to appear perfect, even when everything beneath the surface was falling apart. As the nobles grew more reliant on their perfumes, an increasing sense of paranoia began to seep in. They were no longer just trying to hide body odor, they were hiding their very humanity. What had once been a simple desire for beauty became an obsession, one that trapped them in an endless cycle of perfume and denial. They were forced to maintain an illusion, knowing full well that their personal filth could never be completely concealed. But the obsession with perfume didn't stop there. As the court became more dependent on this fragrant mask, a new danger loomed on the horizon, a more insidious danger than the smell of unwashed bodies. Could the excessive use of perfume and the need to cover up personal hygiene problems actually be contributing to their physical decline? What was being hidden beneath all those layers of scent, and how far would they go to keep their dirty secret buried? In the courts of ancient monarchs, the most demeaning tasks often came with the highest power. Among them was the role of the groom of the stool, a man who held one of the most degrading yet politically potent positions in the royal court. His duty? To attend to the king's most personal and intimate needs, tending to his excrement with a grace that belied the shame of the task. To the modern eye, this may seem like the lowest of positions, serving as the keeper of the king's bodily functions. But beneath this menial task lay a web of power and influence that few could ever imagine. The groom of the stool was not just an attendant, he was the gatekeeper to the king's most private moments, and that access often brought him power that could rival the greatest lords of the land. For the groom, the job was physically and emotionally taxing. He had to endure the discomfort of tending to the king's most private needs, all the while maintaining the delicate balance of reverence and humility. His face, often obscured by the distance between him and the court, hid the toll such a task took on his body and mind. But this was not just about hygiene, it was about proximity to power. Though it may seem like an ignoble job, the groom of the stool's position was uniquely powerful. Few had access to the monarch's personal moments, and those who did were in a position to influence, advise, and gather secrets that could shape the fate of the kingdom. The role was integral not only to the king's health, but also to the political dynamics within the court. The groom's position allowed him to be in the king's inner circle, granting him access to intimate conversations, private moments, and sometimes decisions that could shift the balance of power. Though the job seemed demeaning to outsiders, it was a role that could elevate one's status far beyond the menial tasks it appeared to involve. The groom of the stool, despite his privileged access to the monarch, was trapped in a contradictory world. He was simultaneously a servant and a trusted confidante. The emotional toll of this power imbalance was immense. On the one hand, he was treated with honor and respect in the eyes of the king, but on the other, he was bound to a task that stripped him of dignity in the eyes of the court. The physical intimacy of the role made him indispensable, yet constantly reminded him of his subordinate status. For the groom of the stool, the job was more than physical labor, it was an emotional battlefield. He was always at the mercy of the monarch's whims, yet held more sway over royal decisions than most lords at court. This paradox of power and degradation, so intrinsic to the role, left the groom with an inner conflict, a man of service, yet a man with influence. But what would happen when the groom's influence began to overshadow the court's noble lords? Could his proximity to the throne create opportunities for manipulation, betrayal, and the rise of political intrigue? Could a man, once considered nothing more than a servant, use the power of this intimate connection to change the course of history? In the late 15th century, during the reign of Queen Isabella, Spain saw a curious yet horrifying wave of religious persecution, not against heretics or non-believers, but against hygiene itself. What seemed like an innocent act, bathing, was labeled as sinful, and the Spanish Inquisition turned its eyes not only on religious dissenters, but on those who dared to indulge in cleanliness. The Church, with its overwhelming influence over daily life, declared that to bathe was to embrace impurity. The act of cleansing one's body was seen not as a purification of the flesh, but as an affront to God's design. To cleanse oneself was to imply that one's body, as created by the Lord, was inherently flawed. Those who dared to bathe were seen as heretics in the eyes of the Church. The Inquisition began to crack down on any form of hygiene, targeting bathhouses and public baths. The Church claimed that cleansing the body was an affront to God's will. Priests preached that those who bathed were attempting to purify themselves in a way that only the divine could, and thus they were engaging in an act of sinful pride. This anti-bath ideology wasn't just religious rhetoric, it had real consequences. Bathhouses, which had been common in Spain for centuries, were destroyed. Hygiene infrastructure, once seen as vital for public health, was dismantled. The widespread belief that bathing was sinful led to a rapid decline in sanitation, contributing to the spread of disease and death. The destruction of bathhouses and the rejection of personal hygiene were not just acts of religious fervor, they were also acts of public health suicide. With the decline of sanitation came the rapid spread of disease. Plagues, cholera, and other deadly illnesses swept through the population, and yet the Church's dogma remained steadfast. To bathe was still. The people of Spain, particularly the lower classes, were caught in an impossible situation. On one hand, the Church told them that cleanliness was sin. On the other, they were surrounded by sickness and filth. The idea that hygiene could be evil instilled a deep sense of shame and guilt about basic human needs. This twisted perception of cleanliness became ingrained in the society's psyche, leaving a legacy of fear, disease, and suffering that would last for generations. Amid growing illness, the people lived in fear of disease and fear of sin. The very idea of caring for one's body was condemned, and those who sought to cleanse themselves were often punished. Women, who had once taken pride in bathing and keeping their families healthy, were now forced to choose between their faith and their health. But what if this religious ideology wasn't simply a matter of misguided belief? What if it had a darker purpose, one rooted in the control of the masses? Could the rejection of hygiene have been used to keep the lower classes in a perpetual state of suffering, thereby making them more vulnerable to manipulation? The true cost of the Spanish Inquisition's stance on cleanliness was more than just physical illness. It was a profound control over the people's very lives. The scene opens in a lavish, opulent bathhouse. Countess Platon, dressed in a rich, ornate gown, steps into a large gilded tub filled with warm, creamy milk. The room is filled with the soft sound of attendants whispering as they carefully pour in more milk, the liquid swishing around her as she reclines with a serene, almost ethereal expression. The Countess's skin gleams, her face relaxed as she bathes in the luxury of the milk. Her attendants stand by, preparing the next task. Countess Platon, a noble woman of high standing, bathed daily in a bath of milk, a symbol of her wealth, beauty, and power. It was believed that milk had healing properties, capable of rejuvenating the skin and maintaining the youthful appearance of royalty. But what the Countess didn't know was that the very milk she bathed in, a supposed gift of luxury, was teeming with diseases she unknowingly passed on. In a twisted act of charity, the Countess had the contaminated milk, once used for her beauty ritual, given away to the poor, believing that her noble gesture was one of kindness. She thought she was offering nourishment, when in reality she was spreading sickness. To the villagers, the gift of milk from the Countess was a blessing. They had no idea that it was tainted with infection. What the Countess saw as an act of charity, a way to share her wealth and beauty, was actually a death sentence for the poor who drank the milk, not realizing they were ingesting the very disease that had been spread by the Countess's lavish lifestyle. The Countess's actions reflected a tragic disconnect between the nobles and the poor. In her mind, she was giving back to the community, offering nourishment and care, but in reality, she was unknowingly poisoning those who were most vulnerable. Her high status allowed her to be blind to the effects of her actions, an example of how the wealthy, even in their charity, could unknowingly cause harm. The tragic irony of the Countess's charity is stark. She believed that by sharing her milk, she was offering sustenance to those in need, but in doing so, she unwittingly spread a deadly infection. The poor, already suffering from poverty and illness, now had to contend with the added burden of diseases that could have been avoided. The story of Countess Platen reveals the dark side of nobility's so-called charity, how an act meant to help the poor could, in reality, have deadly consequences. But what if this wasn't just an isolated case? What if many nobles, in their quest for beauty, health and wealth, were unknowingly spreading diseases to the very people they claimed to care for? The line between generosity and harm was often blurred, and the consequences were devastating. Narration: in the courts of Europe, a noblewoman's hair was one of the most important symbols of status and beauty. To achieve the towering, elaborate hairstyles that were all the rage, nobles endured hours of painful grooming, often leading to unimaginable discomfort. But beneath the opulence of these extravagant hairstyles, a dark truth lurked, a truth that no one dared to acknowledge. While the nobles of the court prided themselves on their hair's beauty, what they didn't realize was that the very styles that made them appear regal were also breeding grounds for lice, fleas and other parasites. These elaborate, towering hairdos, held together with heavy pomades, were not just a feat of fashion, they were a nightmare of sanitation. These towering hairstyles, often piled high with layers of powder, pomade, and decorative accessories, were the perfect hiding spots for parasites. The constant use of oils and perfumes to keep the hair stiff and shiny made the hair an ideal breeding ground for lice, fleas, and even ticks. Yet the nobles endured this discomfort in silence, desperate to maintain the appearance of wealth and status. Despite the outward beauty of these extravagant hairstyles, the true cost was not just physical pain, but also the toll they took on the nobility's health. The constant maintenance required to keep these hairdos intact often involved hours of combing, powdering, and restyling. The process was not only uncomfortable, it was unsanitary. The hours spent in the stylist's chair were torturous, each stroke of the comb pulling on the scalp, each layer of pomade adding weight to the hair. The hairdos themselves were so heavy that noble women often had to rely on servants to support the weight of their styles, leading to severe neck and shoulder pain. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the invisible horrors lurking within the hair. Noble women, who were expected to endure these painful rituals for the sake of fashion, had no choice but to turn a blind eye to the growing infestation of lice and fleas. The discomfort was normalized, and the parasites were ignored, as the desire for beauty and status overpowered any consideration for personal hygiene. These hairstyles, symbols of wealth and refinement, were in truth an unspoken burden. To the outside world, she was a picture of beauty and sophistication, but beneath the surface, the toll was evident. The parasites feasted on the noble woman's scalp, feeding off the oil and sweat trapped beneath the layers of hair and makeup. The discomfort, the constant itching, the shame of knowing that her beauty came at a cost, it was all a hidden price of aristocratic vanity. But what if these parasitic infestations weren't just a minor inconvenience? What if they were silently contributing to the spread of diseases within the royal court? Could the very symbols of beauty and power have been harboring unseen threats that could wipe out entire families and courts? The truth about these royal hairdos might be even more horrifying than we realize. Versailles, a symbol of France's power, wealth and grandeur, was one of the most magnificent palaces ever constructed. But beneath its gilded exterior, there was a far darker reality. Inside the palace, amidst its lavish tapestries and glittering chandeliers, was an unimaginable horror, unsanitary conditions that would go unchecked under the reign of Louis XIV, leaving the palace a breeding ground for disease. The grand halls of Versailles, where the finest courtiers, nobles and royalty once walked, were no better than a cesspit. The luxurious palace that was the heart of French monarchy was also a palace of waste. The palace's vast corridors, lined with grand portraits and ornate furniture, were plagued with a severe lack of sanitation. With a population of over 10,000 people, nobles, servants, guards and more, living in such close quarters, Versailles became a cesspool of human waste. Despite the grandeur of the royal residence, it lacked proper plumbing, and the royal court had no place to dispose of the filth that accumulated daily. With no running water and no sewage system, the courtiers, nobles and servants had to make do with chamber pots and buckets, which were often left in hallways or in rooms, awaiting someone to remove them. But the removal of waste was inconsistent at best. As a result, corridors, public spaces, and even some of the lavish rooms were often filled with human excrement. Despite the palatial splendor, the reality for those who lived and worked in Versailles was horrifying. The courtiers and royalty, who had access to the finest luxury, were forced to coexist with human waste. It was a daily degradation, a stench of decaying filth that filled the air. The lack of proper sanitation created a breeding ground for disease, and the poor hygiene led to widespread illness that would have devastating consequences for the court. But it wasn't just the smell. Illnesses such as typhoid, dysentery, and cholera were rampant throughout the palace. The close quarters and lack of proper sanitation allowed diseases to spread like wildfire. What was once the epitome of French grandeur had become a virtual death trap. The very people who were meant to reflect the splendor of the French monarchy were now dying in the shadows of Versailles' majestic walls. For the nobility who lived in Versailles, the contrast between their status and their living conditions was jarring. Their high titles, their elegance, their grandeur, they were all undermined by the filth that lay beneath their feet. The psychological toll was enormous. Despite their wealth and power, they had to endure the daily reality of disease and discomfort, trapped in an environment that, no matter how lavish, could not escape the consequences of poor sanitation. For those in power, the palace had become a prison of opulence, where luxury could not mask the reality of disease and decay. The courtiers lived in fear, never knowing when the next illness would strike, or whether they would fall victim to the very conditions they had created. But Versailles' problems were not confined to the court. As the disease spread through the halls of the palace, its reach would soon extend beyond the walls, bringing death and misery to the streets of Paris. What happened when the plague that plagued the royal family spread to the common people? And how did the kingdom's leadership handle the catastrophe that had been ignored for so long?